On a bitterly cold December morning in 1887, the most powerful man in Pittsburgh descended the marble staircase of his grand Fifth Avenue mansion and saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There, laid out neatly on the Persian rug in the foyer, was his wife's emerald evening gown, still warm to the touch as if she had stepped out of it only moments before. But Evangeline Vandemark was gone. The front door remained locked from the inside. Every window was sealed tight against the brutal Pennsylvania winter. Not a single servant had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. And perhaps most chilling of all three members of the household staff had seen Evangeline go to bed just 4 hours earlier, wearing that very same dress. The Pittsburgh police, under pressure from the city's elite and Cornelius Vandemark's many political connections, closed the case after only 6 days, citing a lack of evidence for foul play. But the truth behind Evangeline's disappearance was far more sinister than anyone dared imagine. It wasn't a sudden vanishing, no act of madness or passion in the dead of night. This was the final move in a long and dangerous game. A woman seeking justice for her murdered father and a husband who had built his empire on the bones of those he destroyed. Before we dive into the tangled secrets behind Evangeline Vandemark's disappearance, I just want to ask one small favor. If you're enjoying stories like this, please subscribe to Sleepy History Tales and tap that notification bell. It helps us keep telling the stories that history tried to forget. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know what city or state you're in. It's always amazing to see the dots light up across the country. Whether you're somewhere quiet in Maine or halfway across the plains of Kansas, you're part of this story now too. Now let's go back to Pittsburgh in the dead of winter. A time when steel barons ruled like kings and murder was just another line in the ledger. The year was 1887. Pittsburgh was roaring at the height of America's industrial boom. Smoke from thousands of furnaces coated the sky in an eternal gray. The air itself felt heavy, thick with coal dust ambition and the silent dreams of immigrants chasing fortune in Pennsylvania's steel mills. It was a city of staggering contrasts. Lavish mansions rose just blocks away from crumbling tenements. A man could climb from poverty to empire or fall from grace into an unmarked grave within the same season. And among all that towering smoke and glittering wealth stood the Vandemark Mansion, a 4-story Gothic revival beast of a home commanding an entire block of Fifth Avenue. Its towers and sharp stone spires cast long shadows over the Allegheny River. The house itself was a monument to excess. Imported gargoyles from French quarries, stained glass windows that didn't show saints but steel mills and railway engines. There was a ballroom that could host 300 of Pittsburgh's elite and a marble dining hall where deals worth millions were struck over oysters and brandy. The estate stretched across 4 meticulously manicured acres, greenhouses, carriage houses, a dozen rooms for staff, and in one quiet corner of the property, the ice house. That ice house, cold and forgotten, would soon play a role in a story no one wanted to tell. Cornelius Vandemark had clawed his way to power from nothing. He began as a common mill worker, shoveling coal and sleeping beside the furnaces. But by the age of 52, he had revolutionized steel production and become one of the richest men in America. He was tall, broad-shouldered with silver hair and icy blue eyes, the kind of gaze that made men flinch in boardrooms. Ruthless in business, worshipped by newspapers, feared by rivals. But the one thing Cornelius Vandemark couldn't control was his wife. Cornelius Vandemark's hands, though now softened by decades of prosperity, still bore the faint calluses and faded scars of another life. Long before velvet gloves and hand-rolled cigars, those hands had shoveled coal into furnaces so hot they could melt iron and strip flesh in seconds. They were the hands of a man who had once believed naively that his inventions could make life better for the very workers who toiled beside him, but that Cornelius had died long ago. Those who had known him in the early days spoke sometimes with sadness, more often with fear of the change. From an idealistic young inventor full of bright ideas, to an industrial juggernaut whose smile masked a ledger soaked in blood. For by the 1880s, Cornelius Vandemark had learned a hard truth about American industry. Brilliance might win you patents, but ruthlessness won you empires. And Cornelius wanted an empire. Innovation alone had not carved out his fortune. In the brutal, unregulated world of Gilded Age capitalism, it was often the quiet acts, the untraceable ones that determined who rose and who vanished. A warehouse accident in Chicago, a sabotaged boiler in Ohio, a competitor's chief engineer who boarded a train and never arrived. To the public, these were coincidences. But in truth, they were Vandemark's invisible weapons, more efficient than lawyers, more permanent than lawsuits. And behind him, always were men who could be trusted to ensure that no one asked too many questions. After all, in an era when government oversight barely existed and police loyalty could be bought with a single political donation, who would stop a steel king? It was during this ascent at the very height of his influence that Cornelius married Evangeline Hartwell. The year was 1882, and their wedding was the event of the decade. Evangeline, the brilliant and radiant daughter of a venerable Boston banking family, was 20 years his junior. Her copper-red hair shimmered like firelight under gas chandeliers, and her laughter could silence a room not because it demanded attention, but because it filled every corner with warmth. She was 25, educated, poised, and every bit the image of New England aristocracy. Fluent in French and German, classically trained on the piano, and a graduate of Miss Porter's School in Connecticut, Evangeline was the kind of woman who could recite Voltaire over tea and then outwit a senator at dinner. But behind the grace and intellect was something else. Something even her husband hadn't anticipated. A conscience. The marriage was for Cornelius a business transaction as much as a personal one. By wedding into the Hartwell name, he gained instant access to the highest financial circles of New England. Evangeline's family opened doors that would have otherwise stayed bolted, giving Cornelius the capital and social credibility to expand his steel empire with a series of aggressive acquisitions. Evangeline, however, had entered the union with far more romantic ideals. She believed she was joining forces with a visionary, a man whose engineering breakthroughs could truly change the lives of working Americans. She did not know not then that to her husband, human beings were just another kind of fuel, and once burned, they were forgotten. But by the winter of 1887, something had shifted. To outsiders, the Vandemarks remained Pittsburgh royalty. But inside the mansion, The mood had grown colder than the marble floors. Evangeline had retreated from the city's glittering social scene. Her once effervescent presence had faded into long silences and distant stares. The staff noticed first. They always do. She spent hours in the mansion's vast library, a soaring chamber with floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with over 3,000 books, leather-bound volumes, some centuries old. First editions of Shakespeare, Newton's Principia, and curiously, an ever-growing collection of texts on American industrial history. But it wasn't just reading. Evangeline had taken to writing furiously obsessively in a leather-bound journal that she kept locked in her desk. The only key hung from a delicate brass chain she wore constantly around her neck, tucked beneath her high-collared dresses like a hidden truth. At night, when the halls were quiet and the fires burned low, she would vanish for long walks through the garden even in the bitter cold. She returned with muddy hems and boots, her green eyes distant haunted. Something was unraveling, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. And no one inside that house, not the butler, not the maids, not even Cornelius himself, could guess just how far Evangeline had already gone, or how close she was to exposing everything. Evangeline's late-night walks, though quietly tolerated by the household, were not the idle wanderings of a restless mind. She often drifted far beyond the garden paths and iron gates of the estate into the narrow, soot-streaked streets of Pittsburgh's working-class neighborhoods. There, amid the shadows of mills and the glow of gas lamps, she would stop and speak with the wives of steelworkers, children with soot-smudged cheeks, and laborers still nursing injuries from the furnaces. She listened. She asked questions no woman of her class was supposed to ask. And what the staff didn't realize was that these quiet conversations were not merely acts of charity, but the early stages of an investigation. Evangeline had begun to notice a pattern, an unsettling trail of industrial accidents that always seemed to follow the expansion of her husband's business interests. Fires, collapses, explosions, disappearances. Where Cornelius Vandemark went, tragedy followed, and she was beginning to suspect it was no coincidence. Inside the mansion, life moved like clockwork. The Vandemark estate employed some of the most trusted and discreet servants in all of Pittsburgh. They had been selected not just for competence, but for loyalty. Margaret Sullivan, the formidable Irish housekeeper, had run the household with iron precision for nearly a decade. She had come to America after the potato blight ravaged her village in County Cork, and she brought with her a sharp mind, a fierce work ethic, and an unshakable moral code. She kept the mansion running like a machine, but she also noticed things, small things, that others missed. And in the months leading up to Evangeline's disappearance, Margaret had begun to notice more than she let on. Then there was Thomas Brennan, the gruff Scottish groundskeeper with a quick temper and a deep devotion to the land. He had fled the Highland clearances with his wife and children in 1868, and he treated the gardens of the Vandemark estate as sacred ground. Every tree, every stone, every inch of soil. He knew it intimately. So when subtle, unexplained changes began appearing in the landscape, new indentations in the earth, disturbed patches of frost, unfamiliar boot prints, he was the first to see them. And he knew something wasn't right. Charles Henley, The butler had once served in the grand estates of Philadelphia's aristocracy, trained in the refined traditions of English service. Dignified, distant, and composed, Henley lived by the code of absolute discretion. He was privy to every formal dinner, every private conversation held just above a whisper in the drawing room. He never repeated what he heard, but in those final weeks, even Charles Henley began to falter. The walls of the mansion had begun to whisper. Then there was Dr. Franklin Westbrook, the Vandemark's personal physician for over 5 years. Westbrook was a Harvard-educated doctor and a respected voice in Pittsburgh's professional circles. He made routine visits to check on the health of both husband and wife. But as the year drew to a close, he began to take careful notes, private records that would one day be discovered and would cast a long damning shadow over Cornelius Vandemark. Westbrook wrote in coded language of marital tensions and psychosomatic disturbances, of Evangeline's deteriorating condition, her growing fatigue, sudden weight loss, tremors, and mood swings. He hinted at something more, something he couldn't yet prove but feared, something that couldn't be explained by nerves or melancholy. All of these people, Margaret Thomas, Charles, Dr. Westbrook, had one thing in common. They were loyal. They had spent years under Cornelius Vandemark's roof, governed by strict routines and sharper eyes. They believed in order, in protocol, in the hierarchy of the house. And yet, despite their vigilance, Evangeline disappeared. Without a scream, without a sound, without a trace. The Vandemark mansion was a fortress of routine. Every minute accounted for, every corridor watched, every servant's footsteps practically choreographed, which is why to those within the household, her disappearance did not seem like a crime. It seemed impossible, unnatural, as though something beyond human hands had intervened. Outside the mansion, the city of Pittsburgh stirred with unease. The air itself felt heavier in that bitter winter of 1887, as if the city could sense what was coming. Violence long held at bay by fear and loyalty was rising to the surface. The recent Haymarket riot in Chicago had sent ripples through the industrial heart of the nation. And in Pittsburgh, workers were organizing. Union pamphlets were being passed in secret. Demands for fair wages and safer conditions were growing louder and more dangerous to those who profited from silence. And in the salons and smoking rooms of the elite, whispers began to spread. Of a hidden cabal, industrialists bound not by profit alone, but by a shared vow to protect their empires at all costs, to silence opposition, to eliminate threats by any means necessary. Which brings us to December 12th, 1887. To the servants, it began like any other cold winter evening. The bells chimed 7 o'clock. In the formal dining room, Margaret Sullivan served dinner to Mr. and Mrs. Vandemark with the same precision she had carried out for years. Nothing was out of place. Not yet. The dining room at the Vandemark mansion was not merely a place to eat, it was a statement, a grand cathedral of Victorian wealth dominated by a mahogany table that could seat 24 guests with ease. Above it, a glittering chandelier imported from Bohemia bathed the room in soft, refracted light, dancing across the gilded frames of oil paintings that lined the walls, each one a commissioned scene of industrial conquest. Iron bridges, blazing furnaces, men in soot-stained shirts raising beams into the sky. all chosen by Cornelius himself, as if to remind every visitor exactly where his fortune had come from and what it had cost. That evening's dinner was as lavish as ever. Roasted pheasant winter vegetables harvested from the estate's own greenhouse and a bottle of 1878 Chateau Margaux drawn from Cornelius's private cellar. A single bottle worth more than a steelworker's monthly wage. But despite the elegance, something felt off. Margaret Sullivan, presiding silently from the sideboard as she had done for years, couldn't ignore it. Evangeline was quiet. Too quiet. She picked at her food, offered only the faintest responses to her husband's stories. Nodding, murmuring eyes rarely lifting from her plate. And then there were the glances. Evangeline kept turning toward the tall dining room windows, her gaze drifting past the frost-rimmed glass, scanning the snow-covered grounds as though she were expecting someone to appear out of the night. She looked, Margaret would later recall, through her heavy Irish brogue like a woman bracing for a storm. Like she knew it was the last time she'd ever sit in that room. And she was trying to remember it all. Cornelius, by contrast, seemed almost exuberant. He spoke at length about a new steel contract with the Pennsylvania Railroad and boasted about his plans to expand westward into Ohio and West Virginia. But Charles Henley, the ever-watchful butler, noticed something beneath the surface. Despite Cornelius's animated conversation and apparent good cheer, he kept checking his pocket watch. Again and again, as if waiting for something planned to occur at a very specific hour. At precisely 9:30 that evening, Margaret helped Evangeline prepare for bed. There were no guests expected that night, yet Evangeline chose to wear her emerald silk evening gown, a gown she typically reserved for large gatherings and musical performances. It was strange, inappropriate, even for a quiet winter night at home. But Evangeline insisted. The gown was a breathtaking creation imported from Paris and valued at nearly $500. Intricate beadwork caught the golden glow of the gas lamps, wrapping her in a soft, spectral shimmer. As she moved, it almost seemed the dress was made of light itself. Margaret remembered complimenting the gown, the first kind words she'd offered Evangeline in weeks that had drawn an actual smile. And what a smile it was. It wasn't forced or brittle, but warm, genuine, and fleeting. A final moment of peace before the storm. What came next would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. Evangeline stepped forward and embraced her, held her, not like a servant, not like a friend, but like a daughter saying goodbye. "Thank you for your kindness, Margaret," she whispered. "You've been like a mother to me these past years." At the time, Margaret had been too surprised to say much. She had simply nodded and helped her mistress into the gown. But years later, she would still remember the feeling. It was a farewell, she told the police. She didn't say it, but she knew. She knew something was going to happen. And for a moment, she looked almost relieved, like she was free of some terrible weight. But there was sadness too. A deep, shattering sorrow buried behind those green eyes. And then there was the locket. As Margaret helped fasten the gown, she noticed Evangeline was wearing a necklace she had never seen before. A small silver locket on a delicate chain. Intricate Celtic knotwork wound its way across the surface, suggesting Irish craftsmanship. An old, perhaps even ancestral meaning. When Margaret gently asked about it, Evangeline's answer was soft but firm. "It holds something precious," she said. "Something that must be kept safe." She did not open it. She said nothing more. It was not the kind of jewelry Evangeline normally wore. There was something sacred about it, something personal and private, and that made it stand out all the more among her usual collection of elegant but impersonal pieces. At 11:00 p.m., Thomas Brennan made his final patrol of the estate's perimeter, trudging through snow with lantern in hand. As he passed beneath the eastern wing, he happened to glance upward toward the second-floor window of Evangeline's private study. There, through the frost-blurred glass, he saw a faint glow. She was seated at her desk. He could see the silhouette, clearly rigid posture, head bent, hand moving quickly over the page. She was writing. Urgently, frantically. Whatever thoughts filled her mind in those final moments, they poured onto the paper with desperate speed, and within hours, Evangeline Vandemark would be gone. The Vandemark dining room was a shrine to Victorian extravagance. A massive mahogany table stretched the length of the room, its polished surface glowing under the flicker of a bohemian crystal chandelier. The walls were lined with oil paintings, dramatic, almost mythic depictions of industrial triumph, each one personally commissioned by Cornelius Vandemark, from the most respected American artists of the age. It was a room meant to intimidate, to impress, and perhaps to distract. That evening, the table was set for 5, but only 3 would sit. Dinner was roasted pheasant winter vegetables from the estate's greenhouse and a bottle of 1878 Chateau Margaux, an indulgence that cost more than most Pittsburgh workers earned in a month. Evangeline Vandemark, however, hardly touched her food. She was quiet, distracted. Her eyes kept drifting toward the frost-kissed dining room windows, scanning the darkened estate grounds as if waiting. Watching, dreading. Margaret, the housekeeper, noticed it immediately. She would later recall her voice, thick with emotion, and her Irish accent barely controlled, that Evangeline looked like a woman trying to memorize the details of her surroundings, as though she knew it might be the last time she'd ever see them. And while Evangeline faded into silence, Cornelius was unusually animated. He spoke proudly about a new steel contract with the Pennsylvania Railroad, about planned expansions into Ohio and West Virginia. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. Charles Henley, the ever-silent but ever-observant butler, noticed his employer kept checking his pocket watch. Not once or twice, but every few minutes, as if he were counting down to something. At exactly 9:30 p.m., Margaret helped Evangeline prepare for bed. Oddly, the young woman requested her emerald silk evening gown, the one she usually wore for parties or diplomatic dinners, never for sleep. It shimmered in the lamplight, a haunting green with intricate Parisian beadwork that caught the light and scattered it like stars on water. Margaret, surprised but compliant, helped her dress, and when she complimented the gown's beauty, Evangeline smiled a rare, genuine smile that Margaret hadn't seen in weeks. Then came something else. A soft, sudden embrace. Evangeline held her tightly, whispering, "Thank you for your kindness, Margaret. You've been like a mother to me these past years." At the time, Margaret had been touched. Only later did she realize it had felt like goodbye. Dear listener, Have you ever felt that eerie weight in a moment that should have felt ordinary? A hug that lingers too long? A goodbye disguised as a thank you? That's how the servants would remember this night. Margaret would later describe the look in Evangeline's eyes as something between sadness and relief, as if a burden had lifted, but at a terrible cost. Before leaving her, Margaret noticed something else, a small silver locket hanging from a thin chain around Evangeline's neck. She had never seen it before. The design was Celtic, the craftsmanship unmistakably Irish, unlike Evangeline's usual collection of understated luxury. When asked, Evangeline simply said, "It contains something precious that must be preserved." She would not say more. At 11:00 p.m., estate guard Thomas Brennan did his final patrol. From the snowy path below, he saw a light burning in Evangeline's study window. Through the frost-blurred glass, her silhouette sat hunched at the desk, writing quickly, frantically. The pen in her hand moved like someone racing the clock. It would be the last confirmed sighting of Evangeline Vandemark alive. Thomas would later tell investigators that her posture that night, shoulders tight, head bowed low, looked more like a woman in distress than one merely writing correspondence. What he could not see was the storm inside that study. Evangeline had turned the room into a quiet vault of evidence. Childhood mementos from Boston sat beside documents that could end an empire. Photographs, letters, maps, all hidden behind false panels in bookshelves and sewn into hollowed-out volumes. On the wall, a map of Pennsylvania and its neighbors punctured with red pins. Each one marked the site of an accident in the steel industry. Explosions, fires, unexplained deaths, all connected to Cornelius and his secret cabal known as the Pittsburgh Circle. Every pin was paired with a note. The name of the deceased, the suspicious cause, and the business advantage reaped in the aftermath. Evangeline wrote furiously that night, compiling everything she knew, everything she feared. It was not a letter. It was a confession, a warning, a record for whoever might survive her. At 6:00 a.m., Margaret arrived for her daily duties. She found the mansion silent. The front door was locked from the inside, iron bolt still engaged. The 12 ground floor windows were all latched untouched. Margaret checked each one herself. She had been trained for this. Upstairs, the second and third floor windows were too high to reach without ladders, and those, Thomas confirmed, remained in the carriage house, blanketed in fresh snow. There were no footprints, no signs of escape, no disturbances in the perfect white veil that surrounded the house. Whoever had left that room, if anyone had did so, without ever stepping into the snow. But it was what Margaret found next that would haunt the staff for the rest of their lives. In the center of the foyer, arranged like a sacred offering on the Persian rug, lay Evangeline's emerald gown. It was still warm. The scent of lavender hung in the air, her scent soft and sweet, like a ghost that refused to leave. The gown was laid out carefully, reverently. Not discarded, but displayed. No buttons torn, no beadwork damaged. Beside it, a single page, torn from her journal. 4 words in delicate cursive: "The truth must survive." If you're still listening, take a breath here, because what comes next is even more unsettling. There were stains on the rug, faint but visible. Not blood, a chemical wash. Something used in hospitals, what Thomas later called the stuff they used to put you to sleep. Her wedding ring or jaw-dropping arrangement of diamonds and emeralds lay abandoned on the marble floor. But the silver locket, the one with the precious contents, was gone. Whoever had taken Evangeline had left behind great wealth, and taken only that. When Cornelius was awoken and led into the foyer, the staff braced for anger, or panic, or denial. What they got was worse. He stood there for several minutes, silent, still, his eyes locked on the gown, not with confusion, but with fear. Margaret would later say it was like he'd been waiting for this, like a man who finally sees the shadow he's been trying not to look at. The structure itself was a marvel of 19th century engineering, built directly into the natural slope of the hillside, its stone walls over 3 feet thick with an elaborate drainage system beneath, designed to keep the interior dry and chilled, no matter the season. On the surface, it was just an ice house, an archaic but practical feature for any estate of wealth in 1880s Pittsburgh. But for Brennan, the estate's stableman, it had begun to resemble something far stranger. Throughout November and into early December, Brennan noticed something peculiar, delicate boot prints in the snow, regularly appearing in the moonlight, leading to and from the ice house. Always the same size, always the same pattern, and always made at night. They matched a pair of boots found in Evangeline Vandemark's wardrobe, but the prints alone weren't what haunted Brennan. It was the consistency, night after night, as if someone was returning to that place with purpose, with ritual. Sometimes faint candlelight could be seen through the cracks in the old timber door, barely flickering against the dark winter trees. Someone was inside that ice house, and they were not alone. On at least 3 separate nights, Brennan spotted something more troubling: a second set of prints, larger, heavier, the kind worn by workmen or factory guards. These broader tracks didn't lead from the house, but from the edge of the estate, the direction of the public road. Someone was meeting her. But who now? If you're listening to this under the comfort of blankets or a warm nightlight, take a moment to imagine standing in that frost-bitten silence, nothing but the sound of wind through dead branches and the distant crunch of someone else's boots in snow. When Detective Crawford later questioned Brennan, the old man hesitated, but eventually revealed all of it. The late-night lights, the dual footprints, and the chilling regularity of it all. But when Crawford turned his attention to the ice house itself, he found an invisible wall not of stone, but of law and money. Cornelius Vandemark personally blocked access, claiming the structure was unsafe for entry. It would require, conveniently, a structural inspection permits and specific legal clearance to proceed, which in the world of industrial Pittsburgh aristocracy meant nothing would happen quickly. Crawford found this deeply suspicious. The ice house was built with the same precision as the rest of the estate. Nothing about it suggested imminent collapse. Still, when he pressed for permission to inspect even the exterior, a team of attorneys descended like vultures. No, they said. A warrant would be required. Not just any warrant, but one spelling out clear probable cause for criminal evidence inside. It was unlike anything Crawford had encountered in over 20 years of police work. Families of the missing typically offered every key, every cupboard. But this felt orchestrated, controlled, protected. 3 days later, warrant in hand, Crawford returned, only to find the ice house had been sealed shut. Fresh mortar, new stonework. The building now bore the marks of rapid professional sealing, and Vandemark's legal team insisted that due to modifications, the original warrant no longer applied. That sealing job, it would have required expert masons, tons of material, a team, and all accomplished within 48 hours during a snowstorm, as if they'd been preparing. And then came the final revelation. Perhaps the one that chilled Crawford more than any boot print or barred door. Evangeline's personal journal was missing. The leather-bound volume that multiple servants had seen her writing in obsessively every evening without fail was gone. The desk where it had been stored was locked tight, no signs of tampering. The only known key had belonged to Evangeline herself. When asked directly, Cornelius Vandemark claimed he had no idea such a journal existed. But Margaret Sullivan, the maid who had known Evangeline since girlhood, swore under oath she had seen Cornelius holding it, flipping through it in the foyer, the very morning Evangeline vanished. And it wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. No love poems, no idle gossip. It was a ledger of secrets. Page after page of dates, sketches, and coded business references. Correspondence names, locations. Perhaps evidence. Evangeline had been writing in it daily for at least 6 months. Dozens of servants remembered her scribbling away in solitude late into the night. Crawford's instincts told him this journal mattered, maybe more than anything else. And as he looked deeper into Evangeline's past, into the once illustrious Hartwell banking dynasty of Boston, he uncovered yet another twist in the tragedy. The Hartwells had been ruined. Once fixtures of Beacon Hill society, the family had suffered catastrophic financial losses, swift, strategic, and almost surgical. In less than 5 years, their name had gone from whispered reverence to forgotten shame. But what struck Crawford wasn't just the speed of their fall. It was how it happened. Their wealth hadn't disappeared through mismanagement, but through very specific, very targeted financial instruments, complex dealings in steel rail and mineral rights. And guess who had acquired those assets in the aftermath? Cornelius Vandemark. The ice house was more than just a storage building. Built into the slope of the hill behind the estate, it was a marvel of engineering. Thick stone walls 3 feet deep kept the structure cool and dry all year long, thanks to a clever network of drainage channels. But in the winter of 1887, it was something else entirely that drew the attention of Thomas Brennan, the groundskeeper. On more than one occasion throughout November and early December, Brennan noticed something unusual in the snow footprints. Small, delicate, clearly belonging to a woman. They led to and from the ice house, and always at night. They matched the boots that had once stood neatly in Evangeline Vandemark's closet. But she had been gone for weeks. What unsettled Brennan most was the pattern. These weren't random wanderings, they were routine. Someone, most likely Evangeline, had been making regular visits to the ice house, alone, in the dead of night. On some nights, Brennan said he'd even seen a faint glow from inside the structure, like the flicker of a lantern or candle hidden behind stone. When Detective Crawford questioned Brennan further, the groundskeeper added something that made his skin crawl. Evangeline hadn't always been alone. At least 3 times Brennan spotted a second set of prints. These were heavier, larger. The kind made by thick-soled work boots like those worn by laborers. But these prints didn't come from the house. No. They approached the ice house from the opposite side from the tree line and public road. Whoever they belonged to had come from outside, and still, Cornelius Vandemark refused to allow police to inspect the ice house. He claimed the building was structurally unsound, insisting a full engineering inspection was needed before anyone stepped inside. Crawford, a seasoned detective, found this excuse paper-thin. He knew the estate's buildings were constructed with obsessive care and no corners cut. Vandemark's refusal rang of something darker, a calculated obstruction. When Crawford asked for even a limited external survey, Vandemark's lawyers responded swiftly, not without a warrant. And not just any warrant, but one that clearly demonstrated probable cause that a crime had been committed specifically within the ice house. It was a level of legal resistance Crawford had never seen before. Most families of missing persons begged for answers, opened every door, overturned every stone. But the Vandemarks, they had closed ranks from the very start. It was as though someone or something was orchestrating a campaign to bury Evangeline's story before it could even be told. When Crawford returned 3 days later, armed with the proper documents, he was met with a new surprise. The ice house had been sealed shut. Fresh mortar had been laid across its only entrance. Vandemark's lawyers now argued that the structure had been significantly altered and that Crawford's original warrant no longer applied. Who had sealed it? Where had the masons come from? No one seemed to know. The mortar was still drying. But something even more vital was missing. Evangeline's journal. It had been seen on her writing desk the day she vanished, a thick leather-bound book she wrote in daily. The desk itself showed no signs of being forced open, and the only key was said to be on Evangeline's person when she disappeared. When Crawford asked Cornelius about the journal, he shrugged, claimed ignorance. But Margaret Sullivan, a housemaid, told a different story. She swore she saw Cornelius reading from the journal on the very morning Evangeline went missing. According to several servants, the journal wasn't a mere diary. It was something else entirely, a record. A log, a project. Page after page of sketches, ledgers, business correspondence, and personal theories. Sullivan said Evangeline had become obsessed with something. She had been documenting patterns. The deeper Crawford dug, the darker it became. Evangeline wasn't just the daughter of a once wealthy family. She was a Hartwell. And the Hartwells had been powerful once bankers from Boston with deep roots in the Northeast. But over the course of 5 short years, their entire fortune had crumbled. Too fast, too precisely. Her father, Harrison Hartwell, had died under mysterious circumstances in 1886, found hanged in his banking office. Officially, a suicide. But no note was left. And friends insisted he hadn't been suicidal or in despair. The Boston police file was suspiciously thin. 1 page, a line or two from a corner, and nothing more. But Crawford had contacts. And those contacts revealed that in the weeks before his death, Harrison Hartwell had been investigating a massive fraud scheme tied to the steel industry. He believed someone or some group was manipulating steel prices using inside knowledge about planned industrial accidents, acquiring companies after tragic mishaps had made them vulnerable. These rumors pointed straight toward Pittsburgh. Even more troubling was the fate of Evangeline's younger brother Edmund. He had left for California shortly after their father's death, or so the family believed. But no one had seen him since. No letters, no telegrams. Crawford traced a man matching Edmund's description to Chicago, where he stayed briefly in a series of hotels under the alias E. Harrison. He paid in cash, never stayed more than a few nights. And then, nothing. He vanished. Crawford began to see the bigger picture. The Hartwells hadn't just suffered bad luck. They had been systematically dismantled through fraudulent loans, rigged investments, and coordinated takeovers. Just as Cornelius Vandemark appeared on the scene to rescue Evangeline with the promise of marriage. But it wasn't just the Hartwells. As Crawford pieced it together, he uncovered a chilling pattern. Other wealthy families, those connected to steel, to labor rights, or to dangerous industry secrets, had also fallen. Some had lost everything in suspicious deals. Some had vanished. Some had died. Each time someone new acquired their assets, and always those companies led back to a handful of men in Pittsburgh. A circle. Crawford began calling it that in his notes, the Pittsburgh Circle. A secret consortium of industrial leaders who for over a decade had murdered, manipulated, and erased anyone who stood in the way of their steel empire. By 1887, Crawford believed they had left behind at least 37 bodies, rivals, labor advocates, family members, and journalists. Suicides, accidents, disappearances. No one had ever connected the dots. Until now, it wasn't just the scale of the destruction, it was the silence that followed. 3 months after Evangeline Vandemark vanished without a trace, the city of Pittsburgh trembled not from whispers in alleyways, but from a thunderclap in steel and flame. At 3:17 a.m., on a bitter March night, a deafening explosion tore through the consolidated steelworks. The crown jewel of Cornelius Vandemark's primary rival industrialist, Henry Rutherford. 17 men were killed, and nearly half the factory was leveled in what official reports called a boiler failure. But the truth, as always, was hiding in the soot. You see, only a skeleton crew should have been present that night. Yet records showed several key engineers had chosen that very moment to work late, an odd choice considering the bitter cold and routine nature of their tasks. And that's when the questions began. The initial fire report was brief, too brief. Faulty machinery, they claimed. A tragic malfunction. But among the working-class neighborhoods of Pittsburgh, something darker was whispered sabotage. The blast had erupted not from a single point, but from multiple origins, almost as if the building had been orchestrated to fall. Even more troubling, several of the mill's safety systems, automatic shutdown valves, early warning fire detectors had been disabled hours before the explosion. Quietly, deliberately, the truth, however, surfaced from the ashes. Or rather, from beneath them. A watchman named Patrick O'Connell, a soft-spoken Irish immigrant and night watch veteran, had been making his routine rounds when the explosion shook the ground beneath his boots. Days later, while helping to clear the debris, O'Connell stumbled across something lodged beneath the wreckage of the administrative building. A scorched, half-melted leather satchel, its contents partially burned, but still legible. Inside, documents. Detailed floor plans of not just the consolidated steelworks, but of other steel mills, throughout western Pennsylvania. Pages and pages of architectural sketches, structural vulnerabilities and annotations, handwritten notes marking guard shifts, blind corners in the surveillance routes, and even the ideal times for accidents. These were not the scribbles of a casual observer. They were methodical, calculated, the work of someone inside. But most chilling of all was the handwriting, elegant, fluid, unmistakably feminine. When Detective Crawford laid eyes on those pages, a strange stillness came over him. He compared the penmanship with letters recovered from the Vandemark estate. And sure enough, Margaret Sullivan, the maid who once served Evangeline, confirmed it. The writing belonged to Evangeline Hartwell Vandemark. Let that settle for a moment. Evangeline, the vanished bride. The daughter of a man whose suicide no longer looked like despair, but execution. And now it seemed a silent hand in a growing campaign of industrial vengeance. But the papers in the satchel didn't stop there. Among the blueprints and surveillance notes were fragments of correspondence letters exchanged between someone signed only as EV and another marked EH. The letters were urgent, passionate, dangerous. They spoke of an intent to expose the circle, to bring justice for father, to dismantle the secret organization of industrialists that had, as Crawford now suspected, orchestrated not just Harrison Hartwell's death, but dozens of others. The tone between the writers was conspiratorial, as though they were partners in both grief and retaliation. Crawford noted something odd about the EH letters written in a masculine hand, refined, deliberate. The sort of script one might expect from a lawyer or academic. Evangeline and Edmund perhaps working in the shadows years after the fall of their family name. And while these revelations unraveled in Crawford's candlelit study, the steel mills continued to burn. In the past 18 months, 7 industrial sites across Pennsylvania had suffered mysterious accidents, collapses, fires, gas leaks, and unexplained explosions. In every single instance, the facility either belonged to one of Vandemark's rivals or was rumored to be a future acquisition target. Coincidence? Or a scorched earth strategy hidden behind suits and cigars? Dear listener, as you drift deeper into this story, ask yourself this. What if the steel barons of the Gilded Age weren't just ruthless businessmen, but quiet warlords in tailored waistcoats? And what if one woman presumed lost had tried to burn their empire down from within? We continue soon, but lock your doors tonight. Some stories don't like being remembered. The deaths didn't always wear the face of murder. Sometimes they wore overalls, or they disappeared into smoke and soot. The methods you see were almost theatrical in their cruelty-staged factory fires, carefully timed boiler failures and disappearances that left nothing but a pair of work gloves on a locker room bench. 3 months after Evangeline Hartwell vanished without a trace, Pittsburgh's industrial heart was rocked by an explosion that sounded like the end of the world. It happened just after 3 a.m. in March of 1888, bone cold and moonless, when most of the consolidated steelworks should have been quiet. Only a skeleton crew was expected to be on duty. But that night, several key engineers were working late, finishing what Henry Rutherford, Cornelius Vandemark's most prominent competitor, called critical production modifications. They never left the building alive. 17 men were killed. Nearly half the factory was reduced to rubble. The official report blamed a failed boiler. Case closed. But whispers echoed through the tenement bars and smoke-filled corners of working-class Pittsburgh, and those whispers said sabotage. Because what was left of the factory didn't point to a single ignition point. No, the pattern looked deliberate. Multiple explosions triggered near simultaneously. More damning still, the building's safety systems had been tampered with. Disabled just hours before the blast. Now here's where the story circles back to Evangeline. One of the survivors, an Irish immigrant and night watchman named Patrick O'Connell, made a discovery that changed everything. While helping clear debris days after the explosion, he found something tucked beneath a collapsed section of the administrative offices, a singed, half-melted leather satchel. Inside were blueprints, diagrams, and handwriting. Beautiful, delicate handwriting, unmistakably female. Margaret Sullivan, Evangeline's old governess, would later confirm it matched the letters Evangeline once wrote in her girlhood. These weren't just idle sketches. No, these were plans. Precise surgical notes on vulnerabilities in multiple steel mills throughout Pittsburgh and beyond. Annotated schematics, security rotations, shift schedules, even proposed timelines for accidents. Some pages were accompanied by grainy covert photographs taken from inside the facilities documenting pressure valves, faulty supports, gas lines, and load-bearing weaknesses. All places where weeks or months later, accidents would claim lives. O'Connell, perhaps too honest for his own good, handed the satchel to Detective Crawford, who by then had resumed his investigation into Evangeline's disappearance in secret. What Crawford read chilled him to the bone. One name kept appearing, EV, and another EH. The letters between them were conspiratorial, urgent, and deeply personal. They referenced a shared mission to expose the circle and to avenge Father. Crawford didn't need a handwriting analyst. He'd seen Evangeline's penmanship. These were her words. And EH, a masculine hand, careful and practiced like someone trained in the law. Edmund Hartwell, her brother, the lawyer who had vanished from Boston years earlier under strange and silent circumstances. Suddenly, the factory fire was no longer an isolated tragedy. Crawford began tracing similar incidents, and what he uncovered shook him. In the span of 18 months, 7 major facilities across Pennsylvania, steel mills, coal mines, machine works had burned, exploded, or collapsed, all owned by men who had either opposed Vandemark's expansion or were negotiating to sell under pressure. Pause. Slow breath. At this point, Crawford wasn't just chasing the trail of a missing woman. He was staring down the blueprint of a silent coup. These incidents weren't accidents. They were tactical strikes timed to cripple the competition when their balance sheets were weakest, when labor strikes or financial shortfalls made them easy prey. It wasn't just about steel. It was about control. Control of Pennsylvania's entire industrial future. Through months of quiet digging, Crawford uncovered the monstrous truth. The Pittsburgh Circle wasn't just a group of powerful men. It was an underground empire, a shadow government of barons, bankers, lawyers, and politicians all working together to consolidate power under a few untouchable names. It began 15 years earlier as a handshake alliance between 3 steel magnates. But over time, the circle grew tentacles: coal mines, railroads, banks, and courtrooms. Even newspapers were compromised, shaping public opinion to fit the circle's narrative and erasing the evidence they didn't want found. They employed former soldiers and private detectives to do their dirty work and hired killers when the subtler methods failed. And as it turned out, Evangeline's father had found them first. Harrison Hartwell, a banker from Boston, had been reviewing suspicious patterns in steel investments for several New England clients. His notes suggested he was preparing to go public with what he knew, but he didn't get the chance. His death was labeled a suicide. Crawford's records indicate Harrison was murdered in his office, staged to look like despair. His son Edmund narrowly escaped the same fate, and Evangeline, she married into the lion's den. Over time, Crawford came to believe Evangeline had discovered the truth and begun working from inside the Vandemark estate to expose the circle. The mysterious visitors who came late at night, they weren't threats, they were allies. Edmund may have been among them, along with sympathetic journalists, union organizers, and the rare, honest policeman. Then came the most ominous thread of all. As Crawford followed the paper trail of Vandemark shell companies, one property stood out, a quiet, forgotten farmhouse in Westmoreland County, 30 miles from Pittsburgh, purchased in 1886. Unremarkable from the outside, but inside it was fortified, reinforced shutters, secret passages, barricaded entryways, a panic retreat disguised as a country home, and signs of recent occupation. Someone had been living there discreetly, carefully, for months at a time. A woman, a fugitive, or perhaps a survivor. In the farmhouse's modest study, tucked deep in the wooded solitude of Westmoreland County, Detective Crawford discovered what could only be described as the nerve center of a hidden war. Maps of Pennsylvania papered the walls, each dotted with pins marking industrial disasters, explosions, fires, sudden bankruptcies. Beside them, hand-annotated newspaper clippings and genealogical charts connected Pittsburgh's wealthiest families like vines in a decaying garden. But the centerpiece was a single large chart, a tangle of red ink and black string that Crawford would later refer to as a spider's web of corruption. At its center, the unmistakable name Cornelius Vandemark. The documents scattered across the desk and filing cabinets didn't just imply wrongdoing, they revealed it in detail. Crawford found ledgers showing how steel prices had been manipulated, how coordinated production halts created artificial scarcity, and how these economic shocks conveniently forced smaller companies to sell off assets, usually to Vandemark-controlled subsidiaries. There were letters between key members of the Pittsburgh Circle casually discussing which rival foreman might be reassigned or what rail depot might next suffer a mysterious accident. And most disturbing of all, photographs. Black and white evidence taken in secret showing powerful men, Cornelius among them, seated around tables in drawing rooms, cigar smoke curling as they pointed at maps and schematics that outlined acts of what could only be called industrial terrorism. Crawford paused often as he sorted through the materials, acutely aware that what he was seeing was not the result of personal greed alone, but a coordinated campaign to restructure Pennsylvania's economy by force and fear. But the farmhouse held deeper horrors. In the stone cellar, a slight creak in the floorboards and a discrepancy in the wall's measurements led Crawford to uncover a false panel. Behind it, a narrow crawl space, and beyond that, a secret chamber. Inside this hidden room, the air was colder, the shadows somehow heavier. There he found dozens more documents and photographs, some bearing the faint scent of ash and damp wood. But these weren't focused solely on economics. These were records of assassinations, of judges paid to look the other way, of journalists who disappeared before publishing, of labor leaders whose speeches were silenced permanently. One photograph made Crawford's hands tremble. It showed the interior of the Consolidated Steelworks boiler room. Red ink had been scrawled across it, marking pressure points and load-bearing seams. In the margin, familiar handwriting offered notes on maximum structural failure. The date November 15th, 1887. It was less than a month before Evangeline disappeared, and nearly 4 months before the explosion that killed 17 men. To the casual observer, it might have looked like proof of guilt. But Crawford had seen too much to accept the surface story. He turned to the hidden chamber's correspondence letters preserved inside a hollowed-out volume of Shakespeare's Macbeth. There the truth emerged like a ghost stepping out of a fog. Evangeline hadn't masterminded the attack. She had been coerced. Letters from the months before the explosion revealed the cruel trade-off she was forced into: provide intelligence to the Circle, or risk the life of her missing brother Edmund. The Circle had held him hostage, not physically perhaps, but certainly with enough threats to bend her will. And yet, Evangeline had resisted in the only way she could. She documented everything, photographed everything, quietly built a case from the inside, even as she outwardly played the part of the loyal wife and socialite. But there was more. Crawford found a series of letters signed only E.H., a cipher that snapped into place when he read the first line. "Dearest sister, the shadows in Boston are watching still, but I remain." Edmund Hartwell was alive, operating under an assumed identity. He had been working alongside Evangeline, gathering evidence from his hidden vantage point, while she recorded what she could from within Vandemark's empire. Together, they had been preparing a coordinated exposure of the Circle's crimes, aimed to protect witnesses, dismantle the conspiracy, and finally tell the truth about their father's death. But their time had run out. The final letter, dated December 10th, 1887, just 2 days before Evangeline vanished, was short. It ended with a line that Crawford would never forget. E. Our father's death was not suicide. She knows we've uncovered the truth. Be careful. They are watching both of us now. If you're still listening, you might be wondering what happened next. We'll get there. But first, let this sink in. A secret room in a remote farmhouse built like a fortress. A sister playing double agent in her husband's mansion. A brother in hiding, forging letters with invisible ink. And a steel empire willing to kill to preserve its secrets. History rarely offers us heroes this brave or villains this calculating. So make sure your doors are locked. The next chapter only gets darker. They plan to eliminate both of us within days. I've hidden copies of all evidence in multiple places. If something happens to me, remember our childhood hiding place. The truth waits there. Do not trust anyone in Pittsburgh. The corruption reaches into the highest levels of government. Trust only the contact in Chicago whose name I gave you. Time is running out. The letter was unlike any Crawford had read. There was no formality left, only urgency, fear, and resolve. But tucked beside it was something even more valuable, a hand-drawn map of the Vandemark estate marked with red X's and coded notations. Among the markings, one stood out, a faded V scrawled over the estate's old ice house. And it was here that Evangeline's secret finally took shape. For months, the estate staff had whispered about her strange habit of visiting the old structure, alone sometimes in the dead of night. But what they took for eccentricity was calculation. Evangeline hadn't been meeting conspirators, she'd been hiding the truth. Piece by piece, she had turned the ice house into a vault of secrets. Photographs, copies of incriminating letters, blueprints marked with warnings, and financial ledgers that traced the Pittsburgh Circle's influence into government contracts, military production, and even the press. Crawford could feel it. Now that he wasn't just tracing a missing woman, he was standing in the wake of one of the bravest, most dangerous acts of defiance in Pittsburgh's industrial history. Evangeline had married the man who destroyed her family and used that role to hollow out his empire from the inside. She wasn't a victim, she was a saboteur. But even as Crawford uncovered these truths, a darker current began to pull at his own investigation. It started with shadows. A man loitering outside his boarding house for too long. Footsteps behind him that disappeared whenever he turned. His mail arrived opened. His interviews with key witnesses. Suddenly interrupted by silence, stammering, or blank denials. The same workers who had once whispered freely about unsafe forges and locked gates now avoided his gaze. One former foreman, once eager to testify, was found unconscious in the river, his pockets empty, and his injuries blamed on a drunken fall. Still, Crawford pressed on. Until April, it was a cold, wet morning in 1888. Rain dripped from the eaves of Pittsburgh Central Police Station, and the city's alleys were thick with fog and coal smoke. That's where they found him. Detective Samuel Crawford face down in the mud behind the station. No bruises, no wounds, just a quiet, lifeless body. Official cause of death, heart failure brought on by excessive drinking. But Crawford's wife, a steely woman named Margaret, was quick to contest it. Sam didn't drink. He hated the taste of it. And he was healthy, no complaints, no ailments. Someone killed him. I know it. She would later testify that he had feared something in the days before his death. He had even begun leaving duplicate files with a trusted friend just in case. But when police searched his desk that morning, every document related to the Vandemark case had vanished completely, like they had never existed. The department ruled it an unfortunate tragedy and swiftly closed the file. But those who knew better saw the truth for what it was. Crawford hadn't died of natural causes. He had been silenced. And in doing so, the Pittsburgh Circle had sent a message to every detective, every journalist, every whistleblower. You can investigate us, but only once. After Crawford's death, the city's elite tightened their grip. Invitations to social clubs became more selective. Access to industrial sites grew more restricted. The press stopped asking questions. Newspapers that once ran editorials about dangerous working conditions suddenly focused on business optimism and rising stock prices. Workers in the mills lowered their voices. Organizers vanished. Men were crushed in accidents that were never investigated. It became an open secret that questioning the wrong thing could cost you more than your job. And yet, something else had been set in motion, because Crawford hadn't worked in isolation. Before his death, he had quietly reached out to detectives in New York and Boston, and even in Chicago, sharing a pattern that stretched across cities and states. Industrial accidents with no clear causes, key witnesses who disappeared, explosions that just happened to benefit a competitor, little ripples moving far beyond Pittsburgh. Are you still with us? You might be feeling the chill by now, that creeping sense that this wasn't just a local scandal, but something systemic, something deep, something designed to survive exposure. Because that's what the Pittsburgh Circle was, not a collection of villains in a drawing room, but an organism, a self-healing system. Kill a journalist, hire another, silence a detective, promote someone more obedient. The gears kept turning, but there were still embers, hidden evidence, letters in code, maps, and survivors. Always survivors. And eventually, survivors talk. The letter was accompanied by a map of the Vandemark estate, hand-drawn and unnervingly precise. Several points were circled in red, each annotated with cryptic notes that suggested the presence of hidden caches, documents, ledgers, letters. Most chilling of all was a mark on the estate's crumbling ice house. Whatever Evangeline had hidden there, it was clear she had been returning to it often. Crawford's mind reeled. All those quiet visits to the ice house. They hadn't been meetings. They were missions. Secret trips to hide the very evidence that could bring the steel empire crashing down. She hadn't just been brave. She had been strategic, methodical. A woman waging war in silence. She had uncovered the full truth that her marriage to Cornelius Vandemark was no accident. It was a calculated maneuver by the Pittsburgh Circle to ensure her silence after the murder of her father. Instead of fleeing, instead of breaking, she had turned her proximity to power into a weapon. By day, she played the role of the steel baron's wife. But in the shadows, she became the architect of his undoing. Crawford knew he had to move quickly. The ice house would be his first destination. But even as he prepared to retrieve the evidence, he felt the noose tighten. Strange men loitered outside his boarding house, pretending to read newspapers in the rain. His mail arrived already opened, resealed, with a clumsiness that felt more like a threat than an oversight. Witnesses who once spoke freely now looked over their shoulders and forgot everything. And then it ended. On a grey April morning in 1888, Detective Samuel Crawford was found dead in an alley behind Pittsburgh's Central Police Station. The official cause, a heart attack. Induced, they claimed, by excessive drinking. But his wife would later testify Samuel hardly drank. He'd been in excellent health. And then came the cruelest cut. Every one of his files relating to the Vandemark case vanished from the police station that very same night. The message was unmistakable. Some cases, they seem to whisper, are not meant to be solved. His death did more than end an investigation. It extinguished hope. It confirmed what Evangeline had feared, that the Pittsburgh Circle would kill to remain unseen. In Crawford's death, the Circle buried a threat and built a warning. In the aftermath, something colder than steel settled over Pittsburgh. The industrial elite closed ranks. Newspapers that once flirted with reform now printed fluff and weather. Mill workers whispered of accidents that followed those who spoke out about labor abuse. Even seasoned politicians reversed course, citing economic stability while turning a blind eye to corruption they knew by name. But corruption has a habit of echoing. If you're still listening, remember, conspiracies rarely end in one city. Crawford had written letters to Chicago, Boston, and beyond, sharing fragments of the story that had cost him everything. And though he died in an alley, his words lived on in envelopes marked confidential. In Boston, Captain William O'Brien was the first to stir. A 25-year veteran of the force, he'd always been uneasy about the official conclusion in the case of Harrison Hartwell, the banker allegedly driven to suicide. But Harrison had left no note, no debt, no motive, just a corpse hanging in a locked office and a case closed far too fast. O'Brien re-examined the files. Furniture had been overturned, papers strewn. There were signs of a struggle, but these had been dismissed as the death throes of a desperate man. Even more troubling was a night watchman's ignored statement. He claimed to have seen 3 well-dressed men leaving the building shortly before Harrison's body was discovered. The report had disappeared. O'Brien attempted to locate Edmund Hartwell Harrison's son, who'd reportedly gone west. But no California registry travel log or court record listed an Edmund Hartwell during that period. Instead, O'Brien found something far stranger: reports from several Midwestern cities of a young lawyer traveling under various aliases who had been investigating industrial corruption and financial crimes. And in Chicago, a new thread began to unravel. Michael Flanagan was no stranger to dangerous stories. A rising star at the Chicago Tribune, he'd made a name exposing the secrets of railroads and factory barons. But Crawford's research caught his eye, especially the part about orchestrated accidents in steel mills. Flanagan started digging. What he found made his blood run cold. The same patterns emerged elsewhere. In Cleveland, in Detroit, elite coalitions of steel magnates, automobile investors, and shipping giants seemed to be coordinating sabotage, suppressing unions and eliminating whistleblowers. The Pittsburgh Circle wasn't an anomaly. It was the model, but the most astonishing revelation came when Flanagan decoded a web of intermediaries and finally reached Edmund Hartwell. Edmund was alive. Living under an assumed identity in Chicago, he had been hiding since the day his father died. He had no home, no career, no peace, only the burden of knowledge. He had moved from city to city, gathering evidence, staying ahead of those who wanted him silenced. And what he'd found, he whispered to Flanagan in that darkened apartment, was even worse than Crawford had imagined. So if you've made it this far, dear listener, we're only just beginning to understand the machinery beneath the steel. Stay with us. The next part is where the ghosts start speaking. The Pittsburgh Circle, it turned out, was merely the head of a much larger beast. According to Edmund Hartwell's meticulous research, this cabal's reach extended far beyond Pittsburgh's smoky steel mills. Its tendrils wrapped themselves around the highest echelons of American power, into the boardrooms of banks and railroads, into the offices of senators and judges, and even into the polished halls of the federal cabinet itself. It was in every sense a shadow government, one that dictated policy behind closed doors and silenced opposition through carefully veiled violence. Among Edmund's most damning revelations was how this conspiracy had manipulated the Panic of 1873. While the rest of the country suffered financial ruin, the circle had quietly acquired massive amounts of distressed property reliance. Factories, even newspapers, at a fraction of their real value. They had manufactured labor unrest to justify military crackdowns, suppressing unions with brutal efficiency. They had influenced tariffs and treaties that protected their monopolies while bleeding the average American dry. But for all its economic cruelty, the darkest revelation was personal. Evangeline Vandemark, Edmund's sister, had not simply vanished on that cold December night in 1887. She had been murdered by Cornelius Vandemark himself with the full backing of the circle's inner council. She had threatened to expose everything to take what she had uncovered to federal investigators, and for that, she paid the ultimate price. But before she died, Evangeline had done something extraordinary. She had created an insurance policy, a cache of irrefutable evidence spread across the country. Blueprints of secret meetings, photographs of clandestine gatherings, copies of incriminating correspondence. She had even managed to use a cutting-edge phonograph device to record the voices of circle members discussing their operations with astonishing arrogance. More than that, she had identified other victims, potential witnesses, who might one day come forward if offered safety and support. Edmund relayed all of this to Michael Flanagan during their secret meeting in a crumbling warehouse on Chicago's South Side. It was a location chosen for its obscurity, multiple exits, shadowed corners, and line-of-sight defenses. But even so, the danger never fully left the room. Edmund had lived in exile for over a year, changing names, cities, disguises, never sleeping in the same bed twice, always looking over his shoulder. He was gaunt, pale, and weary, but his eyes still burned with determination. He and Evangeline had once devised a plan to release all their evidence simultaneously to the press, to law enforcement, and to sympathetic politicians across multiple states. They believed that if the truth came out all at once, the circle would be unable to control the narrative silence, the witnesses, or bury the truth beneath layers of misinformation. But something had gone terribly wrong. Cornelius had learned of their plan, possibly through bribery, possibly through betrayal. On the night of December 12th, he confronted Evangeline himself. She had hoped to reason with him. What followed instead was brutal and final. Edmund received her last message just hours later. A telegram encoded in their private cipher, warning him that their operation had been compromised. It was too late to save her. All he could do was vanish and make sure what remained of her work didn't die with her. That night in the warehouse, as Edmund described his sister's final hours, the grief cracked through his practiced calm. He gave Flanagan a small, worn leather portfolio. Inside were maps, names, instructions for retrieving the remaining caches. It was all they had left, and even that was in danger. A sudden noise echoed down the corridor, outside heavy footsteps, deliberate. Then, the metallic click of revolvers being cocked. Both men froze. They had taken every precaution, but it wasn't enough. The circle had found them. In those breathless final seconds before the door opened, Edmund leaned in his voice, a whisper of urgency. "You must survive this," he said. "The truth is bigger than us now." And with that, he pushed the portfolio into Flanagan's hands. We don't know exactly what happened after that. There are no police reports, no witnesses. No bodies were ever found. Only the portfolio remained discovered in a hollow beam beneath a train station in Cincinnati, months later, sealed and wrapped in oilcloth. What was in it that remains sealed in government archives? Or so they say. If you're still with us, dear listener, I want you to take a deep breath. Imagine the courage it took for two siblings to challenge the most powerful men in America and the cost they paid. If this story left you with questions, that's by design. The mystery of the Vandemarks is not meant to be neatly resolved, but perhaps in the quiet shadows between documented history and forgotten truth, something remains. If this sent a chill down your spine, share it with someone who sleeps with one eye open. Like the video to help keep these lost stories alive. And of course, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Because the past isn't done with us yet, not by a long shot. Let's breathe for a moment, shall we? The year is 1921. Pittsburgh is no longer the soot-choked furnace it once was. The air is cleaner, at least marginally, and the steel titans that once ruled with bloodied hands have either faded into portraits or shifted into more respectable legacies. But time, as you and I both know, doesn't bury everything. Sometimes it just builds walls over it. The old Vandemark mansion had passed through many hands by then, each new owner erasing a bit of its history, or so they thought. It had been auctioned after Cornelius's death in 1903, then repurposed as a private steel magnates club, a bizarre echo of its previous life. By the 1920s, it had become a curiosity of early industrial architecture, slated for interior renovation. The workers arrived expecting little more than creaking beams and crumbling plaster. What they found behind the library's oak paneling changed everything. At first, it was nothing more than a hidden door expertly crafted and sealed so tightly with aged mortar that it looked like part of the original structure. But the moment it cracked open, a musty air seeped out, a breath from a time long dead. Inside, a chamber, barely 8 feet wide, no windows, just a narrow desk, dust-covered shelving, and a trunk. And in that trunk, not gold, not silver, but something far more dangerous truth. Papers, thousands of them, photographs, wax cylinders labeled in a woman's careful script, names, maps, schedules. Some of it yellowed and brittle with time. Other items perfectly preserved in oilskin sleeves, and inside a smaller drawer hidden beneath the false bottom a pendant. Simple silver inscribed with the initials. The discovery made headlines in a hushed, confused sort of way. No one quite knew what they'd found. The new owner of the house turned everything over to the Historical Society. Perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because something in that hidden room stirred the conscience. The society in turn contacted an aging but still shrewd Patrick Flanagan. Yes, the same young journalist who had once run for his life through the alleys of Chicago with Edmund Vandemark. Flanagan, now in his 60s, trembled when he received the telegram. He had never told anyone what happened that night in the warehouse. Not even his wife. The leather portfolio Edmund had handed him had disappeared in a fire at his boarding house just weeks after that harrowing escape. Flanagan had long believed all was lost, but this chamber, this was what Evangeline had hidden. This was the backup, the insurance policy she spoke of, untouched for over 30 years. Now, friends, take a moment. Imagine being Flanagan. Your past rushing up to meet you like a storm. The ghosts you tried to forget suddenly speaking from sealed walls. Would you open the box again? Would you tell the world? What followed in the months after the discovery was a battle between light and shadow. Flanagan, now cautious but determined, partnered with a handful of academics and reform-minded lawyers. Together, they began cataloging the materials. It wasn't just incriminating, it was encyclopedic. Evangeline's records detailed over 24 industrial accidents that had been orchestrated for insurance fraud. There were court transcripts altered, newspaper editors bribed, judges blackmailed. Perhaps most chillingly, the wax cylinders contained recorded conversations between Cornelius Vandemark and members of the Pittsburgh Circle men who had later gone on to become senators, bankers, or icons of progress in their communities. Voices calmly discussing removal options for union leaders. One even joked about needing another fire like 73 to soften up the markets. But let's pause here for just a second, because you might be wondering if all this came to light in 1921. Why haven't we heard of it before? That's where the story turns darker and far more familiar. Stay with me, because in the next chapter, we'll uncover how truth, no matter how carefully preserved, can still be buried all over again. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this mystery with someone who loves peeling back history's quiet lies. Let's walk together now into the shadows of history and discover what happened next in this deadly dance between truth and unchecked power. The hours that followed Edmund and Flanagan's escape were a blur of movement panic and cold, calculated survival. Under cover of darkness in the gritty streets of Chicago, the two men slipped through alleys and abandoned yards using a mix of luck-sharp instincts and the quiet aid of local workers, men and women who had their own reasons for standing against the monstrous machinery of industry. Gone rogue, they weren't just running for their lives. They were now fugitives from an invisible war, a war most Americans didn't even know was being fought. That night marked a quiet but irreversible transformation for them both. They were no longer just a grieving brother and a reluctant witness. They were now marked targets. The Pittsburgh Circle had identified them as threats to be neutralized, and its reach, they discovered, extended well beyond the steel-lined skyline of Pennsylvania. Its tentacles wound through train depots and Cleveland saloons in Kansas City, and even union halls in Chicago. The conspiracy wasn't local. It was national, maybe even global. And yet, what Flanagan held in his hands, tucked beneath his coat in a weathered leather portfolio, could either save lives or sign his death warrant. The papers Edmund had given him were not just a record of past horrors. They were blueprints, plans, future strikes, names, dates, routes, sabotage schedules. Proof that entire communities were being manipulated like pieces on a chessboard, all in service to profit. But back in Pittsburgh, a confrontation was already underway, one that would seal Evangeline Vandemark's fate forever. It happened at exactly 11:47 p.m. on December 12, 1887. Without warning or courtesy, Cornelius Vandemark stepped into her private study, flanked by two men she recognized all too well. Polished smiles at banquets, laughter at charity balls. Now those familiar faces belonged to ghosts with living-skin senior members of what Evangeline had come to know as the Pittsburgh Circle. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Cornelius asked coldly, lifting the damning evidence in one gloved hand. Her photographs, her documents, her letters to Edmund. "You've been clever, my dear, but not clever enough." The words were quiet, but they froze the room. There was no shouting, no theatrics, just the finality of a man revealing the monster behind the mask. Evangeline, who had spent months preparing for this moment, remained composed. She knew the risks. She had taken them willingly, but knowing something and standing face to face with it are two different beasts. She had prepared escape routes, hidden documents, safeguarded the truth, but she had not prepared for the look in her husband's eyes, that hollow vacancy where love had once lived. Her fate, whatever it truly was, would be hidden from the world for 34 long years. And when the truth finally emerged, it didn't come from newspapers or courts. No. It came through the simple swing of a hammer. In the spring of 1921, a construction crew working to renovate the long-abandoned Vandemark mansion, by then repurposed several times and half-forgotten, noticed something peculiar. The library's inner measurements didn't match the outer wall dimensions. Behind the oak paneling, they found a concealed door, and behind it, a hidden chamber, 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, silent, undisturbed. Inside that forgotten room was the echo of a ghost's voice. Evangeline's archive. Shelves lined every wall filled with ledgers, photographs, coded letters, and newspaper clippings. A small desk remained in the corner, untouched, positioned beneath a custom ventilation shaft that had somehow preserved the contents for over 3 decades. It was more than a hiding place. It was a war room, a personal archive of one woman's quiet resistance. Over 200 files documented everything: names, methods, financial trails. The deaths that had once been dismissed as tragic workplace accidents were now revealed for what they truly were: murders orchestrated for profit and covered by layers of corruption. Among the documents were ledgers proving that Circle members had advance notice of accidents and would short sell stocks just before fires or explosions destroyed competing factories. They profited off destruction. They funded their silence with blood. There were also photographs, grainy but undeniable, taken secretly by Evangeline herself during polite gatherings inside the mansion. They showed business leaders, judges, and even mayors laughing, drinking, and planning deaths. But it was the final item that gripped investigators by the throat: a red leather journal. The last entry, dated the very night she vanished, December 12th, 1887, was written in a shaky hand. Evangeline had been under immense pressure, perhaps already certain she would not live to see the dawn. In it, she described confronting Cornelius that evening, laying her evidence before him, begging him to stop the killings. "He told me I had served my purpose," she wrote, "that marrying me had been a calculated move to dismantle my father's influence in Boston, that my family's ruin had been the price of legitimacy." Her voice through the ink was not angry. It was haunted. Cornelius had given her a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: vanish quietly and accept the deaths of her family, or be added to the body count herself. But Evangeline was no ordinary victim. She had planned for this. In her journal, she described her final plan to fake her death, vanish, and ensure that the truth would survive through Edmund, through Flanagan, through this archive. She had accepted that she might never see justice served in her lifetime. But she had ensured that justice would still be possible in someone else's. Pause here, listener. Imagine it. One woman, trapped in a mansion filled with men who thought they had erased her voice. But tonight you're hearing it. The discovery was, in the end, a matter of inches. A group of archivists reviewing architectural plans of the old Vandemark estate noticed a discrepancy. The interior dimensions of the library simply didn't add up with the building's exterior. What began as a minor curiosity soon turned into one of the most haunting revelations in Pittsburgh's industrial history. Behind a rotating bookshelf, cleverly masked by century-old woodwork, lay a hidden chamber, measuring roughly 8 feet by 12. Inside, silence, and the careful preservation of a story no one was ever meant to find. The room had been designed with eerie foresight, lined with shelves, a small writing desk, and a ventilation system that had somehow kept the air breathable for decades. It wasn't just a hiding place, it was a sanctuary and a vault of reckoning. On every wall, every shelf were the life's work of Evangeline Vandemark, a carefully assembled archive of evidence against her husband Cornelius, and the shadowy network known as the Pittsburgh Circle. Over 200 documents, personal letters, photographs, and financial ledgers painted a horrifying portrait of systematic murder disguised as progress. Each page revealed how industrial accidents had been orchestrated, how labor leaders, reformers, and rival businessmen had all died by design. The most damning records traced financial transactions, massive gains from short-selling stock mere hours before competitor factories mysteriously exploded or burned. There were even photographs shockingly clear of elite members of the Pittsburgh Circle taken during social gatherings at the Vandemark mansion. Men in tuxedos casually discussing death sentences over brandy, and tucked among it all, a journal. Bound in red leather, its final entry was dated December 12th, 1887, the very night Evangeline vanished. Her words, though written in her familiar hand, were shaky, scattered. She described confronting Cornelius with the truth, every ledger, every photograph, every body he'd left behind. She begged him to stop. She still believed he might. But his answer was swift and cruel. He told me I had served my purpose, that our marriage had been a convenience, a mask to destroy my father and polish his reputation in Boston's elite circles. But now, I'm a liability, and liabilities don't last. Cornelius had given her a grim choice: vanish under a new identity, and live in exile silently, or share the fate of those she'd tried to avenge. But Evangeline had long prepared for this moment. Together with her brother Edmund, secretly living in Chicago, under an assumed name, she had created a plan, a disappearing act, to buy time, to hide the truth where it might one day be found. The emerald gown in the foyer, the whispers of a ghost, all misdirection, designed to throw the circle off her trail. She used the secret passages Cornelius himself had built, narrow, hidden routes used by servants and by conspirators. But she had misjudged him. Cornelius knew every inch of those tunnels. They were his design. He realized what Evangeline was attempting, and he wasn't alone. That night, as she prepared to flee, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not of maids or butlers, but the hushed, urgent tones of circle members. They were coming, With seconds to spare, she sealed the archive room behind her, locking herself inside with the hope she could wait them out. But the plan, her beautiful, defiant plan, ended in silence and darkness. When workers finally unsealed the chamber in 1921, they found more than documents and dust. Beneath collapsed shelves and forgotten fabrics lay the skeletal remains of a woman, still draped in emerald silk, still wearing jewelry that matched the missing heiress of 1887. A locket around her neck bore a photograph of Harrison Hartwell and a tiny engraving, "To my beloved daughter, Evangeline. May you always fight for justice no matter the cost. Father." 1882. A medical examiner noted signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, defensive wounds on her forearms. She had fought. But the most horrifying detail, scratches, dozens of them, along the inside walls and baseboards, pottery fragments near the sealed entrance signs she had tried in vain to break her way out. Evangeline had been walled in alive, entombed beside the truth she had fought to expose. And then a final whisper, carved into the wooden floor, with what appeared to be a piece of broken jewelry. Edmund, a name, a call, a last hope. Dear listener, if you're still awake, I ask you to take a moment for her. Not as a victim, but as a woman who refused to stay silent, who knew she'd be hunted and buried, but left her truth behind anyway. Her story didn't end in that room, because now, you know it, and some stories once heard never fade again. The circle continues. Stop them. Justice for Father. Ev, 1887. It was scrawled in a shaky hand, likely with the last strength Evangeline had left. That simple message, etched in desperation, became the irrefutable proof that she had never given up. Even as death crept closer, Evangeline used her final breath to pass the torch, urging her brother to keep fighting. And that message, it worked. The rediscovery of Evangeline Vandemark's remains and the hidden archive she had guarded with her life reignited an investigation that Pennsylvania's powerful elite had long hoped to bury. And this time, it wasn't local police knocking on the doors of steel barons and political puppets. The rot was too deep for that. Instead, it was the federal government that moved in under the command of Attorney General Harry Doggy, a man who understood that corruption on this scale required federal force. Inside the dusty chamber, where Evangeline had once hidden, investigators found enough evidence to shatter reputations and destroy dynasties. Names, dates, death orders, payoffs. The Pittsburgh Circle wasn't just an industrial cabal. It was a shadow government operating behind the gleaming facades of steel mills and city halls. For over 40 years, they had pulled strings, silenced rivals, and assassinated anyone who came too close to the truth. The ledger of death was staggering: at least 93 confirmed victims over 3 decades. Business competitors, union organizers, reporters, even judges, and honest lawmen, anyone who threatened their grip on Pennsylvania's steel empire. Their methods? Cold and calculated. Factory accidents, fires, disappearances, suicides that weren't. They mastered the art of invisible murder. And it wasn't just Pittsburgh. The investigation uncovered evidence of similar circles in other industrial strongholds: Chicago, Cleveland, even New York. These weren't isolated crimes. This was a network, a nationwide syndicate of corporate predators who had quietly shaped American industry from behind velvet curtains. And then there was Edmund, living under the name Edward Harrison in Los Angeles. Edmund Hartwell. Evangeline's brother had tried to forget it all. But when federal agents came knocking, he opened the door. What he told them confirmed everything. He and Evangeline had been working with a handful of brave reporters and a few incorruptible detectives. But one by one, their allies disappeared. Some found floating in rivers, others buried in rubble, most never found at all. Evangeline knew she wouldn't survive. She told Edmund, "The night she left, I won't be back." But someone has to know. Even after 30 years of hiding, Edmund's voice cracked as he recounted those memories. His words, along with Evangeline's archive, led agents to secret caches of evidence scattered across Pennsylvania. Names that had once echoed in newspapers as titans of business were suddenly whispered in shame, their dark deeds exposed. One of the most haunting discoveries was the truth behind Detective Samuel Crawford, the man who had once led the original case into Evangeline's disappearance. Crawford had died in 1888, ruled a heart failure. But now we know he was poisoned, silenced. His files destroyed not just to hide evidence, but to ensure no one would pick up where he left off. It turns out, his widow had saved something, a bundle of his personal notes, hidden in defiance of the terrifying men who came demanding their destruction. Those notes became the final nail in the Circle's coffin. He had been closer than anyone imagined. But perhaps the most shocking fallout came not from the mills or alleyways, but from Washington. Senators, judges, congressmen. Some were active members of the Circle. Others bribed and bought. Their exposure sparked the largest anti-corruption sweep in American history, removing dozens of high-level officials. For a moment, even the mighty trembled. The Vandemark mansion, once a symbol of Pittsburgh's grandeur, was demolished in 1923. Officially, it was due to structural instability. But we know better. It had become a house of ghosts. In its place now sits a quiet park with a small memorial honoring those lost to industrial violence. No names, no mention of Evangeline, just silence and grass that covers the past. The steel empire Cornelius Vandemark built was broken apart. The families behind the Circle retreated into shadowy trusts and philanthropic fronts. Many of their descendants still hold sway today, clean suits hiding blood-soaked legacies. But the world had changed. Federal safety regulations tightened. Labor unions gained legal ground. Worker protections, once dismissed as radical, were finally implemented. These reforms came far too late for the hundreds who died in accidents arranged by the Circle. But they marked a new beginning, one that Evangeline's sacrifice helped make possible. Her story didn't just shake the steel industry. It redefined the way America approached corporate crime. Journalists began protecting sources more fiercely. Federal agencies expanded their ability to investigate criminal networks that spanned state lines. And for the first time, the press and government had a clear example of what unchecked industrial power could do. Yet the story of Evangeline Vandemark goes deeper. Her legacy wasn't just about reform, it was about courage. She knew the price of what she was doing. Her husband's wealth could have offered her a life of comfort. Instead, she used her access to expose his crimes, risking everything, knowing full well that discovery meant death. In a time when women were expected to remain silent, Evangeline chose to speak louder than anyone, and in doing so, she rewrote the story of what one person, just one, can do when faced with an empire built on lies. Here at Sleepy History Tales, we often ask you to lean in and imagine. But this isn't fiction. Evangeline's body was real. Her journal was real. The people she named died real deaths. This wasn't a ghost story, it was a buried truth. Evangeline vanished into the December night of 1887. But her voice didn't stay buried. In 1921, the bricks that had concealed her chamber crumbled, and with them, the illusion of power's invincibility. Her story reached beyond the grave, haunting the men who thought they had silenced her. It took 30 years, but justice came. In whispers, in signatures, in prison cells. So now we ask you, do you believe everything truly came to light? Or are there still chambers beneath America's industrial history waiting to be opened? Could something like the Pittsburgh Circle still exist? Only now using algorithms instead of telegrams? Satellites instead of steel? Let us know what you think in the comments. Would you have had the courage to do what Evangeline did? If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep in your bones, share it. Subscribe. Ring that little bell so you don't miss our next tale, because at Sleepy History Tales, the past is never really past. And sometimes, the dead have the last word. We'll see you soon.